Tonight, we begin with a development that Pentagon officials had feared, intelligence analysts had monitored, and defense strategists had prepared for since the first weeks of this war. A development that unfolded not over months of deliberation, but in a matter of days. Days that changed the battlefield calculus entirely. Days that exposed critical vulnerabilities in Russia's once feared war machine. Days that may have altered the trajectory of this conflict permanently. What Vladimir Putin did this week crossed a line that Western allies had hoped would hold. And when that line broke, the United States did not hesitate. They responded with precision, with overwhelming capability, and with weapons systems that have now fundamentally transformed Ukraine's military potential. What you're about to hear represents one of the most significant shifts in modern warfare, a moment when classified American technology entered the hands of Ukrainian forces, turning what Moscow believed would be a war of attrition into something far more dangerous for the Kremlin. This is the story of how secret weapons became Putin's worst nightmare. For several months now, there had been signals, not official Pentagon briefings, not formal White House announcements, just signals that Washington was preparing something unprecedented for Ukraine's defense. The United States has been cautious, yes, but they have been methodical in their caution. Their weapons deliveries have followed a certain pattern, a predictability, almost a choreography designed to avoid triggering direct escalation with Moscow. But what set off alarm bells in intelligence circles this month was that the pattern went silent. Analysts who monitor American military logistics know the indicators. The unusual movement of specialized transport aircraft, the encrypted communications between defense contractors and European staging areas, the sudden classification upgrades on previously routine shipping manifests the quiet deployment of American technical advisors to undisclosed locations near the Ukrainian border. All of that went quiet. And whenever Washington goes quiet about military aid, it means something is about to get very loud on the battlefield. The silence wasn't an oversight. It was intentional. Because what the United States was preparing to deploy couldn't be announced not until it was already in Ukrainian hands and ready for combat. Early this week, satellite reconnaissance systems detected what analysts described as highly unusual thermal and electromagnetic signatures, including activity at forward Ukrainian positions that had not been observed in over 18 months of monitoring. These are the kinds of signatures that advanced weapon systems only produce when they are being activated for operational deployment. These aren't the signatures of standard artillery or conventional missile systems. These are something else entirely. Intelligence officials didn't know initially which category this fell into, whether it represented defensive capabilities, offensive strike systems, or electronic warfare platforms. But what they did know was that Ukraine's tactical posture was changing dramatically. And when a military force that has been fighting defensively for months suddenly shifts posture without explanation, even by small measure, every intelligence agency in the world pays attention. What emerged over the following hours sent shockwaves through Moscow's military command. The United States had deployed classified weapon systems that Russian forces had never encountered in combat systems that would neutralize key advantages Moscow had relied upon since the early days of the invasion. The intelligence assessment issued by Western defense agencies this week was not normal. It was not routine. It was not symbolic. It was urgent. Official after official, briefing after briefing, described Russia's latest military moves as desperate, unsustainable, and perhaps most importantly, increasingly vulnerable to the new capabilities now in Ukrainian hands. But Russian escalation only works if the target hesitates. Ukraine did not. In fact, their response this week was among the most devastating we've seen in this entire conflict. Here's what we know. Within 72 hours of receiving the new American weapon systems, Ukrainian forces launched a series of precision strikes that left Russian commanders scrambling. These weren't the same HIMARS rockets that had been degrading Russian logistics for months. These weren't the standard drones that had been harassing Russian positions. These were next-generation systems platforms that Ukrainian forces only deploy when they are preparing to fundamentally alter the battlefield equation. And alter it they did. Tonight, multiple defense sources confirmed that Ukraine launched coordinated precision strikes on critical Russian military infrastructure including a major command center that had recently been reinforced for what analysts believe was a planned spring offensive. Ukrainian forces struck before Russian commanders could disperse their assets. They hit the command nodes. They hit the logistics hubs. They hit the air defense batteries that were likely preparing to protect advancing Russian forces. In other words, Ukraine targeted the nervous system of Russia's entire southern front. The coordination capability that would have made their offensive operational, this is what made the intelligence warning so urgent. Russia's troop buildup wasn't just symbolic, it was actionable. It represented the kind of threat that could have achieved significant territorial gains if left unchecked. And Ukraine, armed with America's most advanced systems, understood that fully and responded with force. Not recklessly, not impulsively, but strategically. They didn't waste munitions on frontline infantry positions. They didn't target empty fields or decoy installations. They hit command structures. They hit the logistics arteries that Russian forces depend upon for ammunition, fuel, and reinforcements. Defense analysts are calling this week's operations a masterclass in precision warfare, the kind of surgical targeting that requires not just advanced weapons, but advanced intelligence, advanced training, and advanced coordination with Western military advisors. And here's where the story becomes even more significant. Intelligence officials now believe that Russia's latest escalation was designed to test the resolve of Western support after months of political uncertainty in Washington. Putin wanted to see whether the United States would waver, whether European allies would fracture, whether Ukraine would buckle under sustained pressure. But instead, the opposite happened. Washington didn't hesitate. They deployed capabilities that were so advanced, so precisely targeted, that even the Kremlin noticed. You don't get Moscow's attention easily. But this week, the United States and Ukraine did. Defense analysts speaking with international media under anonymity described Putin's strategic shift as operational desperation, a way to force a negotiated settlement before Ukraine's capabilities grow even stronger. But Ukraine proved this week that they remain both capable and lethal. Their strikes were not only accurate, they were timed so precisely that Russian forces had no opportunity to relocate critical assets. That timing matters because it shows something crucial about the new weapon systems. It shows that Ukraine is not merely receiving hardware. They are receiving integrated targeting packages, real-time intelligence feeds, and coordination with American reconnaissance platforms that make their strikes virtually impossible to defend against. As reports continued coming in throughout the week, we learned more about the scale of Ukraine's response. Ukrainian long-range strike units carried out attacks on Russian staging areas over 200 kilometers behind the front lines, forcing emergency evacuations and logistical chaos. Special operations forces targeted radar installations that had been upgraded by Russian technicians in the last 90 days. Ukrainian naval drones operating in the Black Sea reportedly destroyed or disabled patrol vessels that Russia had been using to threaten grain shipments and coastal infrastructure. This wasn't just harassment. This wasn't just attrition. This was systematic degradation. This was strategic paralysis. And strategic paralysis is the one thing Russian military planners have struggled to prevent since the early months of this invasion. For every advance they have made, Ukraine has countered with something that makes that advance more costly, more difficult, and ultimately more futile. The new American weapon systems have accelerated this dynamic exponentially. Remember, Vladimir Putin thought this war would last weeks. He thought Ukrainian resistance would collapse after the first major offensive. He thought Western unity would fracture under economic pressure and political division. He thought American weapons would arrive too slowly, in quantities too small, with capabilities too limited to change the fundamental calculus. But tonight, the exact opposite is happening. Ukrainian forces are more capable than at any point in this conflict. Western unity has strengthened rather than weakened. And American weapons, including systems that were never supposed to enter this conflict, are now destroying Russian military assets with unprecedented efficiency. Every assumption Putin made has been proven catastrophically wrong. And the consequences are becoming impossible for Moscow to ignore. What makes this moment so critical and so dangerous is that Russia's latest escalation happened at a time when Putin is under extraordinary internal pressure. Military hardliners want faster, more aggressive action. Economic advisors want to preserve what remains of Russia's financial stability. Intelligence officials want to avoid direct confrontation with NATO, and political allies want victories they can present to an increasingly skeptical Russian public. Putin is balancing these demands while losing the initiative on virtually every front. And when leaders in that position make sudden, aggressive moves, they're not doing it from strength, they're doing it from pressure. They're doing it from vulnerability. They're doing it because they see the window for achieving their objectives closing rapidly. The new American weapon systems have accelerated that closure dramatically. The Pentagon statement, now distributed to allied defense ministries across NATO, was designed to signal that the United States is not willing to allow Russian aggression to succeed. Officials said plainly that Moscow's latest military moves were inconsistent with any genuine interest in peaceful resolution. That is diplomatic language for, we know what you're planning, and we've already positioned to defeat it. You don't usually hear that tone from Washington unless something serious is at stake. The message was unmistakable, not just to Moscow, but to every nation watching this conflict. The United States has crossed a threshold in its support for Ukraine. There is no going back. Meanwhile, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky addressed his nation in a defiant, determined speech tonight. He said, "Our partners have given us the tools to defend our homeland. We are using them with precision and purpose." He said, "Every weapon we receive brings us closer to victory. Every strike we deliver weakens the occupation." And he said, "We will not stop. We cannot stop. Our freedom depends on finishing what we have started." These are not rhetorical flourishes. These are statements from a wartime leader who understands just how high the stakes have become and who recognizes that the weapons now in Ukrainian hands represent a genuine turning point. Here's what makes the situation even more concerning for Moscow. The American weapons deployment wasn't isolated. Along with the primary systems delivered to Ukrainian forces, NATO allies also accelerated their own advanced weapons deliveries. European defense manufacturers increased production specifically for Ukrainian orders. Allied intelligence agencies increased targeting support, providing real-time data that makes Ukrainian strikes virtually impossible to evade. All of this happened within the same 2-week period. When Western allies move multiple capabilities at once, it means something larger is underway. This is coordinated, this is deliberate, and this is designed to ensure that Ukraine has overwhelming advantages in the next phase of combat operations. Defense analysts are now considering several possibilities. One is that Russia is preparing a final major offensive designed to achieve territorial gains before Ukrainian capabilities grow even stronger. Another is that Moscow is attempting to create conditions for a negotiated settlement that would freeze current battle lines. A third possibility, the one worrying officials the most, is that Putin is attempting to escalate to de-escalate, creating a crisis severe enough to force Western concessions. But this week, Ukraine took that card off the table. They didn't wait for Russian forces to mass. They didn't allow command structures to coordinate. They didn't give logistics networks time to prepare. They struck first, struck hard, and struck with capabilities that Russian defenses simply couldn't counter. What we're watching now is a test of resolve. Putin wants to see whether Western support will waver under pressure. Ukraine wants to show that victory is achievable with sufficient commitment. Washington wants to prevent escalation while ensuring Russian aggression fails. And Moscow wants to prevent a defeat that could destabilize the regime itself. The stakes could not be higher. And the weapons now in Ukrainian hands have fundamentally changed how this test will play out. Tonight, we've heard from intelligence officials who are now monitoring Russian command communications in real time. They say Moscow is scrambling to understand the full extent of the new Ukrainian capabilities. They say Russian defensive postures are being hastily reorganized to account for strike ranges that weren't previously possible. And they say Putin's decision to escalate this month is likely part of a broader strategy intended to achieve gains before Ukraine becomes truly unstoppable. But Ukraine is not backing down. In fact, Ukraine is pressing their advantage harder than at any point in this conflict. Their response this week, swift, precise, and devastating, sent a message to Moscow that the old calculus no longer applies. And it sent a message to Washington that every weapon delivered is being used with maximum effectiveness. As the coming weeks unfold, We expect more details to emerge about what exactly these secret weapon systems are and how they are being employed. But what we do know is that America's decision to deploy them was timely. It prevented Russia from consolidating gains. It disrupted Moscow's offensive planning at the most critical moment. And it demonstrated that Western resolve is not weakening, it is intensifying. What happens next will depend on what Putin does in the next 30 days. If he escalates further, this moment will be remembered as the beginning of his strategic collapse. If he seeks negotiations, Ukraine and its allies have already shown they are prepared to negotiate from strength. They have shown they are ready to respond to any scenario. And tonight, for the first time in months, Moscow appears to be genuinely uncertain. The Kremlin is quiet, too quiet. And when Putin is quiet, it means he is calculating. It means he is choosing his next move carefully. Because tonight, Vladimir Putin learned something he has learned many times since this war began. Underestimating Ukraine is a fatal mistake. Underestimating Western resolve is equally dangerous. And underestimating American military technology is the worst miscalculation of all. This story is far from over. But tonight, one thing is clear. The weapons that were supposed to remain classified are now on the battlefield. The capabilities that were supposed to be too escalatory are now destroying Russian military assets. And the nightmare that Putin feared most, a Ukraine too strong to defeat, is becoming reality. We will be here watching every detail as the next phase of this conflict unfolds.